Alright folks, quick film study today on Emanuel Navarrete, which is right now is one of my favorite fighters, and I knew about him because he defeated one of the prospects here in the Philippines, which is Juan Miguel Elorde, and then he went on to defeat Gio Santissima as well. So it's really a back-to-back Filipino beatdown, and it was kind of hurt, or it was kind of painful for me, but you gotta accept and you gotta appreciate his greatness as well. So we'll start off with his stance switching, which he does both on the defensive side and on the offensive side. For this particular sequence, we're gonna look at the defensive side of things. So how he switches from southpaw to orthodox and orthodox to southpaw in order to stay away from his opponent. Now, what we see with Navarrete is whenever he tries to defend a punch, he shifts from his front foot to the back foot, which is very common among boxers nowadays. But then the problem with Navarrete is he gets off balance sometimes, and so what he does to avoid being off balance and to avoid being caught with a good shot is he decides to switch from an orthodox stance to a southpaw stance, which is a very subtle switch. But I'm telling you, if an orthodox fighter switches to a southpaw, or if you switch stance in the middle of your combos, that tiny distance between you and your opponent can make a lot of difference. If you are standing in a orthodox stance and then you switch to a southpaw stance, that tiny little bit of distance that you create between you and your opponent, it makes a lot of difference. And so we see that a lot with Navarrete. Sometimes it's just like an inch, his opponent misses by an inch, and that's because of his ability to switch. And even though the distance is not as long as you may think it is, that tiny distance can make a difference between what lands and what does not land. Alright, here it is again. And here you see a very dangerous right hand thrown by Gio Santissima, which is very powerful if you watch a lot of other fights of Gio Santissima back in the Philippines. He does have a pretty good right hand. And you see the difference that it makes, even though it's just a tiny bit of distance. So let's say Navarrete was able to lean back, and that's what made Santissima miss. But this right here, if he did not switch to a southpaw stance, he probably would be off balance, and Santissima would probably follow it up with a leaping left hook, which I think he did. I'm not sure. No, he didn't. Okay. Switches to a southpaw stance, and then right here, from a southpaw stance, he's gonna throw a left hook and apply some pressure once again. So you see how he transitions from, or how he uses that stance switch to get a little bit of rest, and then he goes back to pressuring his opponent again. So for this particular one, he will throw a right hook, and then he will miss it. To avoid getting countered, right here, you see his right foot kind of pivoting, and that's one of the reasons, or that's one of the things that you do when you throw a right hook. You kind of pivot that right foot. So instead of being caught, or instead of following it up, he just decides to, look, I'm going to step back. So he steps back right here, and he goes back to an orthodox stance. Now, in terms of the defensive side, what he does is he pulls back, right? He leans back over here, and then he finds himself off balance. That's why he resorts to that last second switch, where he takes this left foot and then he puts it back, or he puts it on the rear. Whenever he's on the offensive side, however, it's a different thing. Sometimes he will throw a right hand, and that right leg is going to follow him, making him a southpaw all of a sudden. Sometimes he will counter by, or sometimes he will throw some punches, and then his opponent will throw it back, and then he will go to a southpaw stance. Anyway, I'm rambling too much. Let's just see some examples here. Alright, so for this particular one, I'm going to talk to you guys about how he transitions from an orthodox stance to a southpaw stance without leaning back. Because when you're leaning back, it's very easy for your feet to follow your body whenever you're trying to lean back. And so what I'm trying to show you guys is how he transitions it on the offensive side, or how he transitions it without leaning too far back. Alright, so what he actually does is he brings his feet together closer. So right here, you see his feet is much closer to each other, making it easier to transition from an orthodox stance to a southpaw stance. So instead of having this typical gap between his feet, he will be a little bit more squared. Right here, he's a little more square, and then he covers up. Then when Santissima proceeds to throw a punch, it's easier for him to just take a slight step back here and then go ahead and throw a left hand load up. As he puts that left foot back, he loads up and then he throws a left hand and then a right hook. Okay, so it's bringing your feet closer together, which makes it easier to switch stance without being off balance. Because here's the thing, folks, if you try to switch stance on your typical stance, orthodox stance, without bringing it closer together, like, let me show you. If you try to switch stance from this gap between your feet, right, what's gonna happen is it's gonna be hard to find your footing, because this front foot right here, or this rear foot right here, this right foot, when you put it back or when you turn into a southpaw, this will have to be diagonal the other way, because a southpaw, when the right foot of a southpaw is facing to the left, or sometimes it is squared up. But on this case, when you're an orthodox, your right foot is facing on the right, which is different. And so if you switch constantly, you're gonna lose footing eventually, because you don't know exactly where your feet must be. And as you guys know, the feet follows the body, right? So if you switch stance all the time, your feet is gonna face all kinds of directions and your body will follow that direction, making you off balance. So you see it right there. When Navarrete just brings his feet closer together, you'll see that again here. He throws a left hook or a right hook, then a left, boom, and then he takes a pendulum step, bringing his feet closer together, making it easier to transition from an orthodox to southpaw without leaning back. Because when you're leaning back, it's a natural mechanism of your body to switch, because your left foot is going to follow and your left foot is going to be transferred to the rear side, because that's what's going to keep you on balance. Okay, so there was a right hook there. He takes a slight step back with his right foot. He doesn't take it all the way back there, making it an instantaneous switch between a southpaw and an orthodox. So I want you to look at it again. He does not take this right foot all the way back. He takes it just a little bit back, and then now he's squared. Okay, he's not losing his footing. He can choose to go back to southpaw or go to orthodox, and then in this case he decides to go orthodox. Then here's the last one, an example of transitioning again. Here, after he slips to the left, throws a jab on a southpaw stance, and then he slips to the left. He brings his feet closer together once again. Instead of taking that right foot all the way back there, okay, I'm gonna draw an arrow there. Instead of taking his right foot all the way back there, which can lead him to losing his footing, possibly tripping, possibly being off balance, he puts his feet together first in a squared stance. This way he can choose whether or not he can put that left foot and turn orthodox, or he can put that right foot in front and turn southpaw, which is both good because he's not going to be off balance anyway. And then on this case, he decides to turn orthodox. So these are all basic things, but if you think about a lot of people who try to shift or have difficulties in shifting from orthodox to southpaw, one of the reasons why is because they can find their footing. They lose their footing, they trip over, they don't know what to do, they're off balance, and it's because they're trying to make it as an instantaneous switch, instead of bringing their feet together first in a squared stance and then choosing whether or not they want to turn southpaw or they want to go back to their orthodox stance, or vice versa if you're a southpaw. Okay, let's talk about now his awkward punching and the angles and timing in which he punches from. So here you see Santissima ducking. Okay, Navarrete is pressuring him. You see Santissima ducking. Now instead of trying to follow Santissima and letting him get away, he decides to throw a left hook. Even though it's not really a perfect angle to throw a left hook from, because Navarrete is kind of facing this side right here, and then Santissima is already getting away. Instead of just trying to chase him, he decides to throw an awkward left hook from a very awkward position, and he lands that shot pretty well. Okay, so if your opponent is moving to the right, it's a good idea to throw the left hook, just like what Navarrete did here, even though the angle is quite awkward. Boom. And then it just catches your opponent off guard. Why? Because the more awkward your timing is, the harder it is for them to figure you out. Okay, so the harder it is for them to read what you're going to do. There are certain instances where fighters or your opponent cannot really determine or are not really expecting. They're not really expecting a punch during those kind of situations. So in this instance, when your opponent is typically getting away, they're not really expecting any punches from you. But then on this case, Navarrete did not do that, right? Navarrete just decided to throw a left hook regardless. And then Santissima did not expect that because it was running, and when you're running away and when you're moving laterally, people tend to think twice of punching you, and so you don't really expect that coming. Alright, here's another one. Now for this case, again, he's moving away. Here he's pivoting. He's moving to the left, he pivots, not really expecting a punch. Navarrete throws a right. Boom, he misses the first one. And because Santissima already pivoted away, he's not expecting any punches anymore. He misses with his first right. Instead of pondering upon that and trying to chase Santissima, not really punching, he decides to keep on punching, even though it's a very short right hand here, and he still lands it pretty nicely, right? So there are certain times when your opponent is not really expecting you to punch them, and those are the times that you should take advantage of. When they're moving away, they're not really expecting you to punch them. They're not really expecting you to try to land a punch because you're pretty far away from them, but Navarrete somehow finds a way to create an angle and then land a punch. Alright, here's the next one here. What happens is Santissima is running away, backpedaling, and then Navarrete is running forward. Again, on this instance, Navarrete or Santissima is not really expecting Navarrete to punch because he's pretty far from him. But guess what happens? He chases him forward, and then he catches him at a very unexpected time. Just as he's approaching him, he times him pretty well, and then he lands that right hand.